Hi, welcome to Powerssquared Raw and Real. This is number 34, and we are continuing on our long episode or continuation saga. I don't know what you want to call it, about religion and writing. Sometimes we get the writing in there, but this is really about our lives and growing up in very religious culture, the evangelical culture, and how we both moved out of that. So last week, I'm M.A. Powers, by the way.
And I'm JL Powers.
So last week we were talking about your like young adult ages, and I'm gonna let you recap a little bit. I'm just gonna say that we had just gotten into not just gotten into it. We'd been discussing the nitty gritty of like the place of women within our religious culture, and when kind of the whole internet failed on us and we stopped the broadcast. So just recap a little bit the group we were in, and kind of that you're questioning the culture that we had grown up in, and the ramifications of that real quick, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So in my college years, I was really involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the university that I went to, and really felt a real failure of relationships towards the end, among other things. And I don't really think I got into this last week, but our mom started volunteering at the college with the organization, and there was I'm going to keep going. There was a conflict between her and the staff leader, and the staff leader didn't, of course I'm biased towards my mom, but even 20 years later, looking back, I can see that, mom was really just wanting to volunteer and help out. And she was kind of accused of, trying to take over and power mongering. And it was a really painful time. And during all of that time, kind of my relationships started falling apart in that organization. The staff leader did not handle things well at all. He, made public accusations that, later were clearly lies. He didn't apologize for that, or I guess he apologized to my mother later, but didn't apologize ever to me. It was just sort of a kind of a bad time. And I think I exemplifies something that I've discovered, when there's not a whole lot of, power in these organizations. Like, the less powerful something is, actually, the more people seem to fight over the little bit that's there. But anyway, I felt like I had to escape. And it was complicated. I certainly had struggled to be, the exemplar Christian. I had a lot of pride, the sin of pride, etc. And that manifested in the relationships that I had with people. And so that kind of fell apart. And I was also dealing with the sexual abuse that I had, undergone as a child when I was 8, and then later in my first romantic relationship. And dealing with that also, just made me very emotionally vulnerable during this time period. And I don't think I really ended up with the kind of support that I needed. And so relationships fell apart. So I really felt like I left that organization with basically none of my relationships very intact. And again, it was very complex. I certainly don't put all the blame on other people. I hold my share of blame in all of that. But I went to Youth with a Mission, and got very involved with one of the programs at Youth with a Mission called King's Kids. I did a missionary trip to Australia, India, and Uzbekistan for about 6 months, and at DTS. So a number of things happened in Youth with a Mission. One was that I really struggled I started questioning women's role in the church. I felt very much like a second-class citizen, and I was not getting satisfactory answers from anybody. In fact, when I brought it up, I became the troublemaker for bringing it up. And, people really just wanted that question to go away. They didn't want to deal with my questions. And I began to be viewed as a troublemaker. Rumors went around. I think I mentioned last week some of the rumors. But I also wanted to talk a little bit. I didn't talk last week about, some of the things that happened when I was in Australia going through the discipleship training system. And there, I think I want to talk a little bit about money and
yeah, that'd be great.
Some of the things that happened there. So we were missionaries, which meant we were, we weren't, some people that came and did this had worked for a while and saved money and had money. And most of us didn't have any money to do these missions trips. And so it was required that we be supported by outside people who would send dibs and drabs of money or sometimes big amounts. And this was all, this is all part of kind of worldwide support for missionaries. But the whole money issue.
For people who are not in the culture, you can't, as missionaries don't necessarily, well, as you probably don't know, many missionaries don't work for an organization that really provides them money. And the ones that do work for organizations that provide the money, that organization has to go out and ask churches and people to support that organization, which then that organization then supports the missionaries. So there's a big money, how you get money. Yes. And you will talk about that now. But.
Yeah. So, I had to, before going on DTS, I had to kind of raise the funds for the first 3 months, which included my plane ticket there, the 3 months of room and board while I was there doing the training. And then we all had to kind of raise money for our missions trip, which in my case, I went to India and Uzbekistan. And there was a lot of pressure put on us to raise the money. And the teaching around it was this sense of, if you were called to do this, God was going to provide the money in some way. And if the money wasn't coming in, then there was clearly some sin in your life that was blocking you from getting the money. Right. Now,
the sin of unpopularity.
Right. The sin of not having good relationships with other people, or the sin of not knowing enough Christians who wanted to pay money to go on your missions trip or something like that. Right. And and literally the DTS leaders, they didn't call me in because, because I thought at the time that I was really called to be a missionary, probably long term. I was taking this very seriously from the get-go and developing relationships. So when people gave me money, I was writing them thank you notes, and I was sending out a monthly god-awful, letter to my supporters that I don't have any examples of
newsletter, but
newsletters. So they're also fundraising.
It's a missionary newsletter, but not missionary, I guess. That's what it is.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure those were pretty fake. I can't imagine how authentic I was. I felt like I was being authentic. I was telling people about.
Well, then, I think if you feel it, you probably were being authentic at the time. You just look back on it with different eyes, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Authenticity has nothing to do with reality.
Right.
But
what do you mean by that?
Well, I know that sounds weird, but you can believe something totally falsely wrong and be very authentic in how you comport that, in a sense, because you're authentically living out something that is not true. I know that maybe that's an oxymoron, because authenticity is supposed to be authentic, right? That there's a fake and then there's authentic, but authenticity is an emotional response to a belief. Right.
Well,
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I hear you, and I guess I was being authentic, but when I think about, you know, my belief about my position, that I
Sure.
somehow had what it took to help other people, and it just it feels like an awfully egotistical place to have been coming from. And so, as authentic as I may have been, I think that
Sure, but
ego really
right.
showed through and was probably horrific. Although, like I said, people were reading it and they were supporting me. So I was taking it very seriously, and I was writing handwritten letters to my supporters every week. I was spending lots of time. So the truth is that I didn't have a really horrific time. The money was coming in, but I remember as we had the teaching on DTS, we were given all of these stories about people, so there was this one person, and these stories were intended to illustrate the idea that if you were obedient to God, the money would come.
Right, but
No matter
that's
how
right.
silly it was, whatever God asked you to do, you did it.
Right, but this
And
is
so,
like a cornerstone. This is the cornerstone of evangelical culture right there, right? Is that you will be blessed if you are in God's will, but you have to be in God's will. So anyways, continue.
right,
It's
right.
all parts of life, not just money. I mean, it's like that is a cornerstone to most modern evangelical culture, even if they don't state it that way. It's
Right.
and the blessing doesn't necessarily have to be monetary, but it means that you're going to be happy, basically.
Right. Um, so in any case, they what they would do is we would have these nights scheduled, these blocks of nights for 4 hours where we were coming to listen to God and do whatever God told us to do. And they had told us these stories. Like there was this one DTS kid somewhere, sometime in some place of the world. And I should add that the details of who he was, where he was, what gender he might have been, it could have been a girl, none of these things mattered because the actual facts of the story were not as important as the idea behind it. And the essence and idea behind it was that if you did what God told you to do, no matter how silly, you would have the money that you needed for DTS,
For life, for
your mission
everything.
trip, for everything, right?
Right.
And so one of the stories they told us was about this guy who, felt that God told him to just go out and start picking up random pennies that he saw, places. And over time, those pennies added up miraculously to the several $1,000s that he needed over like a really limited amount of time, right? In the course of a week, he somehow picked up a couple $1,000s worth of loose change lying around wherever in the world he was. And this miracle was because of his obedience to God. He did what he said. The Bible verse behind it, or the Bible story behind it, I'm trying to think.
It's probably the Jesus's miracle of the fish and the loaves, where like
Yes.
there wasn't enough for everybody, but then by praying and God, and the division of this one thing multiplied into enough for everybody, right?
Right. There were 5,000
Even
people there, and they
even
had
though
two
it was
fishes and 3
silly,
loaves
right?
of bread, and it
Right.
multiplied to feed all the 5,000.
And it was silly, right, to the disciples. They thought it was silly. You can't feed everybody on 5 loaves of bread and 3 fishes or 2 fishes. I don't remember the story, but specifics. But anyways, yeah, so the idea is that it seems stupid to our worldly mind, but to
Right.
God it makes
And
sense.
it's possible.
Right. So
Right.
anyways,
Exactly.
you were
And
taken
so
into this room.
we had received different teaching and different stories that were meant to prep us. And then we were taken into this room, it was like one night a week for about 4 hours where we were supposed to listen to God. We would all sit there. We'd, sing worship songs. And this sounds really cheesy looking back on it. And we would pray, and we would, people would pace up and down one part of the room, like listening to God or praying or asking, God to release the money, etc. But the idea was whatever God told you to do, you should do it. And I remember one guy on our DTS later said, like, he left the room for a little bit and he came back and people were like, well, what'd you do? And he said, well, I felt that like God told me to go out and look under this big rock and outside, under this tree. So I went out to this tree and I lifted up the rock and our DTS leader was like, and he was like, there was nothing there. And the DTS leader was like, it's okay. The important thing is you are obedient and you don't know what that might release. And that, and so,
right.
so we were all doing these things, right? And, maybe one person felt like God told him to call his aunt and apologize for something he'd done or whatever. And so we did these things, right? Like you had a phone there. You would phone the people that God told you to phone, or you did whatever.
Right.
I don't think I ever did much more than pray. But I remember having this feeling, and here's the thing, like one of the things that I did, because I took seriously all of these notions. And so one of the things that I believed was that, the idea that you should tithe 10% of your income to God.
Right.
And so, I was already, anytime money came in, if it was $25, $2.50 was tithed. If it was $500, $50 was tithed. I tithed 10%, even though I was a missionary on a missions trip and didn't have any money, like 10%, that was my income. 10% of my income should go to God. So I was already like secretly, and I wasn't telling people this, but I'd go to the person that was managing the money and I'd tell him, I'd say, here's my $500 that came in this week from people. Can you direct $50 into this person's? Because I know that they're struggling to get money. So I was doing that. But one of the ideas that kind of came into my mind during this time was the idea that I was supposed to give away all my money to somebody else, like all of it.
Yeah.
No, 100% of my money I should give to somebody else on the team.
Right.
And the idea that dropped into my mind, like, sent me into this real panic, because I had been working and working and working hard to, get these little dibs and drabs of $25 here, there. Most people on the DTS were going out to eat during the week or on weekends. And like, I had no money for that kind of thing. And so, I was like, basically the one person on the DTS that, they'd all go out to eat pizza on Friday nights and get beers and stuff. And I was staying home in my, because I didn't have $5 for pizza.
Right.
And so this and also because I was like recognizing this money was coming in, I needed to be super responsible with it. And, and so this idea that I was supposed to give it away just sent me into this panic. And then I felt for a week, I felt this panic and I felt like, but if I wasn't obedient, I was going to lose everything in life, well,
I mean, but we've been prepped, but it's not just that story. It's the story of Jacob and Isaac. Is that right?
Well, there was the woman who gave away her, the poor woman who gave away
her mite,
her mite, and that God counted that as much bigger than, because she gave away everything she had. There was, certainly there were stories of like, who was it that took refuge with a widow, and as long as he took refuge with this widow, she had enough oil and flour to constantly make.
It was Elijah or Elisha, and I can't remember which one.
Yeah. So I mean, there were so many biblical stories that were coming into this and making me feel real panicky about, was God really asking me to do this? And if I did, what if the money didn't come in? And meanwhile, there were people like my good friend of mine, who is a single mom, and there with her 2-year-old, she was called in to the carpet and they kind of glared at her and they said, "Where's your money? What's wrong? What sin?" And after this meeting of hers, I went up to visit her in the little room that she lived in with her 2-year-old, and she was just crying. She was angry, and she I'm getting a little echo if you want to turn it off. She yelled, like, she looked at me and she said, if that money doesn't come in, I'm not going to believe in God anymore. You know, like she just was losing it because she was being called on the carpet for why isn't this money there? Well, the irony of it all. And so I felt like, you know, this is directly my responsibility too, because, you know, I was supposed to give away all my money. And obviously it must be to go to her or something, right? Anyway, it just sent me into this horrific kind of panic and crisis of faith. You know, something that just only later, when the DTS leader sheepishly acknowledged to her when she had proposed something to them long before, because she got a stipend every month from the Australian government as a single mom, and it was more than enough to cover her missions trip. But they had told her, nope, you have to have the whole amount from the beginning. You can't, like, you know, pay us $1,000 in March and $1,000 in April and $1,000 in May when you get it from the government. But then they sheepishly acknowledged that they could actually do that. And so then she was fine. But in the meantime, she had gone through this kind of horrific accounting where it was demanded of her, what sin have you committed that means God isn't giving you the money, when she had the money all along, you know? And I was meanwhile like having this kind of meltdown of, I had the money, so there was no sin in my life that was preventing me from getting the money. But what sin was I in the meantime committing by not giving away all my money? Oh, it's just horrible. I mean, I know this sounds like ridiculous and absurd probably to a lot of people who are outside of the culture or never been in it, but it was just a horrible time.
Yeah. There's definitely some elements
horrible.
there's definitely some elements of cult-like behavior within that system there. And
Right.
I'm not saying it's a cult, it isn't, but I'm just saying there's some power behavior like that that's
oh, sure.
not okay.
And then let me tell you something that happened with that money. So we went to Uzbekistan, and one day, you know, and you had to trade your Australian dollars for Uzbek, whatever it was. I don't remember. And one day, our DTS leader came back and admitted sheepishly that, I guess there's a number of sheepish moments, but he had gone, well, actually he was angry. He wasn't sheepish. He was angry because he had gone to trade money, and it had been stolen from him. And it was at that point that I discovered that he was trading money on the black market. So he wasn't going to legitimate banks to get money, which was a far lower price, you know. He was going out on the streets and trading the money on the black market. And so we lost a bunch of money at that point because it was stolen. And then it got even stickier because I was like, I don't think we should be trading money on the black market. Like,
right.
That seems somehow wrong to me.
Right.
And then, you know, he got really upset with me for sort of insisting that we be above board, because he was like, well, that means we're going to have less money at the end to do something fun in India. Right. And I was like, fine. But it feels really dishonest to be taking the money that people have given us and trading it, you know, in this underhanded way on the streets. Now, I might feel a little less honest these days. I don't know. But at that time, I felt like, no, we should be above board and legal and, you know, completely. So that I just wanted to point out that little irony of, you know, something that happened. But anyway, to that money that, you know, wasn't coming in because of sins in our lives, and then got stolen. Something like $500 got stolen on the black market because we were trading that money on the black market. Anyway. Yeah.
It's only a sin if somebody else is committing it, right?
Right. So things were definitely, I mean, at this point, I was still fully committed. I came home and I worked full time in Youth with a Mission with King's Kids in El Paso for the next year. And it was really the next year that things really fell apart because, I mean, I was already scarred by some of the teaching. I mean, it just didn't seem right to me, the kind of ways that we had been treated. And then I was questioning things with women. And in King's Kids El Paso again, I was suddenly ended up being viewed with suspicion because of my feminist underpinnings you know, I could just see that the culture, like I was beginning to feel very claustrophobic in this conservative evangelical culture. I didn't feel valued as a woman. I didn't see the women around me valued in the same way. They were definitely seen as lesser. I had was beginning to have a deep theological problem with this.
And then the whole I think one thing for you and for me is the anti-education, anti-intellectualism, which there are problems with intellectualism, snobbery that run deep and cause lots of problems. I'm not denying that, but that full on, like, that has come to fruition later in a bunch of movements about, like, we are not going to listen to somebody who's an expert, was probably niggling you.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, the thing about this was not in our family. Our father has a PhD in geology. Our mother was Phi Beta Kappa, had a bachelor's in journalism and a double major in journalism and social work. And, they were an educated couple that didn't have any suspicions about education and believed in it. So our family didn't,
Cover that. No, not at all.
And also, as I had talked about during homeschool, Dad definitely looked at some of the science textbooks that came out of Abeka and other, and he was like, I mean, they're outright lying, they're twisting ideas, they're mispresenting information. This is not legitimate. So we didn't have those same suspicions, but we could definitely see those suspicions in terms of things like evolution, etc. And so, I mean, certainly that was an issue, but I can't think of any stories surrounding that. For me, just the recognition that my questioning of women's place in the church was leading people to view me with suspicion, and even pass rumors around that I was a lesbian and, demon possessed and and things like that was, a bit of a problem for me. So
after that year, how did that all split? Like, you split out. What did you do?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Like, how'd you break out of that?
Well, it came gradually. And another issue for me was actually LGBTQ issues. I mean, still at that point, I probably accepted kind of the idea that it was a sin, but I was deeply bothered by the way people in the church, at least in the evangelical church, saw LGBTQ people, and there was definitely a strong, hatred. And I heard Christians use, words that, about gays, that it was just like, there's no way that that's acceptable to, on the one hand say, we're supposed to love humankind and Jesus came to die for people's sins and loves everyone, God loves everyone. And then to, call gays faggots. Right. It was like, hello, there's a real disconnect here going on. And that disconnect, ultimately led me, especially when I went to graduate school and started encountering LGBTQ folks who became friends. It was like, there's just a problem here. And but some of that came later. The leaving of the church was really gradual. So I spent a year full time doing it. And then I started graduate school at UTEP. And I started a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And I just didn't have the time to be involved anymore. But also some of those, you know, that first year, it was a 3-year program. And that first year that I was involved, or that I went to graduate school, I was still somewhat involved, but that was when a lot of those, you know, relationships started to fall apart, where people were kind of viewing me with suspicion because of my viewpoints. And I was really connecting for the first time, really, you know, my 4 years in undergraduate college. Yes, of course I went to classes with other people, but my friends were all InterVarsity Christian Fellowship folks. And so all of my friends, you know, it was a kind of self-reinforcing system of relationships that where, you know, people believed essentially the same thing. And there might be some minor disagreements within it, but, you know, you all in the end loved Jesus and were going to heaven and etc. And for the first time, I was really connecting with people who are completely unconnected. I was becoming friends with people who are completely unconnected with the church.
Right.
And they were perfectly nice people.
Right. Well, I knew them.
Yes, you knew them too. Well, we moved in as roommates together.
Yeah.
And you know, your journey didn't parallel mine. It came later, but but you were attending as an undergraduate and at UTEP, and we roomed together. And but you know, I think really for me at first, when I started moving away from the church, it was, and from, you know, being a Christian and the faith, it wasn't, at that time, I would have explained it like this. I still love God and I still believe in God and I still believe in Jesus, but the culture of the church is suffocating me.
Right.
Or of the American church.
Right.
I cannot exist within this culture. It doesn't have room for me. And I just needed to get out of that culture. But as I moved out of that culture, at the same time, I began to question a lot of the theological basis for certain beliefs. I wrote a graduate level paper on Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a lengthy poem telling the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and you know, falling from sin, and it comes from the perspective of Satan, at least in part. It's been many, many years since I've read it, so I don't want to mischaracterize parts of it, but it, you know, had this perspective of Lucifer, the angel who fell from heaven and you know, ends up tempting Eve to take the fruit, and Adam accepts it. And in analyzing this poem, I really kind of tried to contextualize it historically to look at why it was necessary for Christians to believe that Satan was not an evil being created initially by God. That it was really important that Satan had one time been an angel of light that served God and had been created to be, you know, a good person, and had selfishly and sinfully chosen another path on his own. And I was examining this theology for a couple of reasons. One, it was really important to, it's an important theology to underpin this way, because if God created an evil being, then is God evil? Can God really be all good? And so the idea that Satan must have been once an angel of light who fell from heaven, who chose, you know, and warred with God in heaven, was a really important theological underpinning. But this wasn't something that early Christians necessarily saw. And I wrote this paper 20 years ago, so I don't remember everything, but I remember recognizing that Milton really popularized this idea of Satan, of Lucifer warring with God in heaven and taking a third of the angels with him to earth and becoming Satan. And that this popularization in this literary poem then gets read back into and interpreting the Bible, right?
Right.
And so that it wasn't that Milton took this idea so much that had been around for a couple thousand years, but rather he was using it to justify this theology, which was necessary to understand free will, to believe that, you know, humans aren't destined to be either evil or good, but that they have free will to choose, and that God didn't create evil, that God was all good, completely good, etc. And that these underpinnings, like, they weren't birthed with Christianity, that suddenly everyone understood that these things came into play as people began to realize the theological necessity for things. And that you couldn't then, if you looked at the historical trajectory of how Christianity developed its theology and its interpretations of certain biblical passages, you could recognize that these things developed as people in the church have oh shit moments. And
that it's not shit. And it's not just like here's your theology, God up in heaven, handing down this plate.
Right, exactly. And as people have these oh shit moments and develop and popularize a certain theology, then it comes into play as this orthodoxy that everyone understands, and you have to believe that. And that puts into question, are these interpretations, if you look at the biblical passages that are used to justify these theologies, is it really so cut and dried? Is it really so clear?
Right.
And once you begin to do that, it's not so clear.
Right.
It's not so cut and dried. It's not so obvious and evident. And then you begin to wonder.
That's what they're afraid of, is that this is a house of cards, and once you pull one down, they all come down. And for some people that's true. For you and me that's true, but not for everybody. But still, continue.
No, I mean, there are definitely people that, you know, have some of the same, maybe not the same experiences that I have, but, you know, start with some of the same questions and assumptions and end up, you know, solidly back in Christianity and evangelical Christianity even, and all of those things.
But this is our story, not theirs.
But this is our story, not theirs. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that.
No, but my point is that it isn't inevitable you'll end up where I ended up. Some people don't necessarily have the same feeling of betrayal, that recognizing that these theologies are cobbled together and popularized and aren't necessarily so self-evident.
Sure. And I think that's why we often hear there's a strain of Christianity that it's kind of a veneer, and it talks about the pure Christianity that that we're part of the early church, whatever that means, right? It's your interpretation of what the early church is, but really there's all these ancillary bric-a-brac of theology that have kind of been stuck and pasted onto Christianity over the millennia. But really, we follow the early Christian pure church and whatever that is, and that's why we have it together, because we don't have all that, or that theological bric-a-brac that has accumulated over the centuries.
That's the presentation that they give, right?
Exactly. But then I asked them, so what is the pure church? So that, are you going to give up all that you own? Like, just hand it over? Is that how you're going to do it? Because I think that's kind of what they did in the New Testament. Then people start to hum and haw a bit. Again.
Chapter 2.
Oh God. It's another, sorry, straw people.
Right.
Beat 'em,
Right.
beat 'em,
Right.
beat 'em. All
Right.
right,
So
keep
let's not beat
going.
up on
Sorry,
straw
I'm
people.
beating up on
This is definitely
straw
about
people. That's
our,
very easy. That's easy to do, and I apologize. I don't want to do that because this is
yes,
our story, not their story. So keep going.
exactly. And yes, go ahead. One. Um, so so things were just falling apart for me, and relationally and theologically around the same time. And when your theology begins to fall apart and you don't have those relationships to fall back on because people aren't in fact the loving, kind, wonderful, amazing people that they're supposed to be,
Right.
according to, you know, the theology,
And
then it becomes less. Now, I will say that I
Right.
have known and still know to this day wonderful, amazing Christians. You know,
Right.
I just want to
Right.
put that out there. Like
Right.
there are people from that time period in my life and even from before that I still have deep respect for.
Sure.
And that includes mom and dad. You know, I mean,
Right.
they really take it seriously, and it's made them better people. They are good
Right.
people that don't try and justify bad behaviors, and that take these questions seriously and don't try and shove them under the, you know, bus. And so again, to, you know, get rid of that straw man idea, like there are people I know who are still within that world that I have the deepest of respect for, and who didn't ever, you know,
I think that you know that.
stop
Do you
being my
mind if I?
friends just because I was
Right.
going through all of this stuff. There were
Right.
lots of
Right.
people who did, you
Right.
know, who just like,
Right.
you know, but they're just a small handful of them, though.
Right.
Seriously, a very small handful.
Right. Right. But I think.
I can think of two besides mom and
Right.
dad.
Right. Right. Sure. And I think yeah,
And they're my friends to this day. Although, you know,
right.
one of them I haven't seen in years, but you know, I would still love to see her. But you know,
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that rejection, so people can't separate themselves from a culture, right? And so it's difficult. It's hard for people to separate the fact that when somebody is rejecting something, that they're not rejecting the necessarily any one individual within that thing. And so of course, unfortunately, I think it it's particularly hard, at least in the evangelical culture that I grew up with, for because the idea was that, okay, there, if you reject Christianity, you're going to go to hell, and there's like no way of coming back. Like if you truly reject this, then there's no turning back. Like you can accept it once, and if you reject it, and there's some Bible verse about this that they use to do it, then you'll never come back, right? Even yeah. And so you're like rejecting God forever and ever. Amen.
right.
See you in hell, sucker.
Well,
You know, but also it's you're rejecting something very close and personal to them, and it comes
Not
from fear
everyone.
too. It can be
Not
from fear.
everyone, of course, has
Right.
that belief that you can't come back.
Right, that's true.
In fact, most people I know don't. That
Yeah.
I know who are still in the evangelical world don't believe
Right,
that.
but it's the same.
But that is
Right,
a
but there,
belief, a subset of some.
right. But there was a big argument within the subset that I knew of that was like, were you really saved in the first place if you reject God? Because if you were really saved, you would see how incredibly awesome this, you know, culture is, and how, well, not culture, but how incredibly awesome Christianity is, and how loving God is. And like, you couldn't possibly, if you were really a Christian, you couldn't possibly reject God. That's the theology underpinning it. So like Satan is the only person who could really reject God, right? Because he's the only person who knew God and then rejected it and became evil. Whereas us as humans, we couldn't have ever, so we were never really saved in the first place, right? Because because of how awesome it is to be saved, we couldn't possibly reject God after that, right? So we still have hope because maybe we were never saved in the first.
There you
Sorry.
go.
All right, here
There
we
you
go. Sorry.
go.
I don't
Maybe
mean
not.
to go off on that tangent and interrupt your story, because your story is much more interesting.
No, the tangents are interesting too, actually. I think there's some people that deeply care about the tangents, maybe more so than the story. So don't stop tangents. But no, and I think to go along with that, I think the reality is that it was deeply painful for me because I did feel rejected. I felt like these are people that should still love me.
Right.
Or at least, should still kind of, be part of my life, even if I'm not, and it was such a repudiation of their actual beliefs that they didn't, it said to me, they may say that they believe what they believe, but if they really, believed in a loving God and that they were meant to love people, and then they wouldn't stop being my friend just because I'm struggling with this and not so sure that I'm a Christian anymore.
Right.
And so to me, it was a huge judgment on them to this day, to be honest. To this day, it is. I wish that I could soften that.
Right.
And backpedal from that and say, no, but the truth is it said a lot to me then, and it says a lot to me now. Although, I've reconnected with many of them via social media, and it's all fine and good, but in that way, but I still feel that way. It was like, had there been a really different response on the part of the Christians that I knew and loved and had been in a relationship with, who knows where I would be today. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there wasn't, there wasn't. So here we are. But it was so painful, it was so painful to sever those relationships and to have those relationships severed. And I don't for a second doubt that it was painful for them too.
No,
or for some of them.
Right. And so it was this. Yeah. And so this combination of you interacting with people outside of the culture, along with all the questions that were coming within it, that really started to motivate that movement. Of course, everything happens in stages, but that was the big.
Yeah. Those were the big things. And the recognition, that in fact there was a lot of grace outside of the church. Now, grace is a concept that the church, that's kind of fundamentally a base point for Christian theology. This idea that you don't deserve love and kindness, but you're offered it anyway, that this is God's compelling love for you. And there's this idea too that you only discover this kind of radical kind of grace within the church because only people that have received that radical grace from God can offer it.
Right.
And the fact that I didn't receive it again was this like, okay, but that didn't necessarily mean it wasn't true, right? And I recognized that too. But when I started to see that there were lots of people outside of the church who weren't believers in Jesus, who maybe had never been believers in Jesus, but who offered the same kind of kindness and love to people.
In fact,
it was that was so, it was so telling to me and so important to me. And it was such a relief too, because if it wasn't there and it wasn't there, I was so alone, but I found it outside of the church. And so I wasn't so alone,
Right. Yeah. And no, that makes total sense. And I think in some ways, and every culture has its unforgivable sins, whatever that culture is, including the ones that we move in all the time that have nothing to do with Christianity. But there's a relief sometimes with certain people, because you realize you don't, yeah, I screw up all the time and they don't actually care. It's not even that, like, that's a hard thing for me even now, because I still feel bad about things that were considered sins in the church that
Mm-hmm.
just don't make any sense. I mean, we knew a lot of people who were teetotalers within the church, and so drinking was always a real, like, kind of,
Like,
half
even if it's maybe not a sin, it's probably not a good
good
thing.
thing, right?
Right.
And it probably, health wise, it probably isn't, but like being around people who, like, it's just not even like, that's not on their radar. Like, sin, what do you mean having a beer is a sin? Like,
Right.
I'm going to hell with my 18 pack, so there's a relief in that too, right? With
Right.
being with people, there's almost a grace in that, because it's not even like I have to forgive you. It's just like, what are you talking about, man? You're you and I'm me. Let's do this thing.
Yeah.
There's a relief in that,
Huge relief.
instead of always having to check around each other and kind of like, what do you think on
It's
this
okay.
small little issue? Is that a sin for you? But this isn't, like, and that's really fraught within relationships, within that particular culture. I know I was affected deeply by that, but
Yeah, I think I was too. And yeah. Um,
treading very carefully all the time in relationships, because you can't just be like, still, me having a hard time accepting other people just point blank, because I still have that baggage, is a
mhm,
tough thing for me.
mhm.
I do it, but it's like a mental thing. It's not just a natural thing where I'm just like, yeah, okay, whatever, I don't
Right.
like, yeah, so yeah,
Well,
that baggage is still there. It's just
yeah.
different.
Yeah. It's less. I mean, I don't have most of that baggage anymore. And
Yeah, mine's much less, but
you know,
it's still there. It's not intentional at all. It's just like a reflex. It's not,
yeah.
and it's a reflex. And then I stop it, right, and move on. But still, it's still there. It's like you hear people just like cursing up a storm, and I use bad language all the time now, and like my reflex is kind of like, ugh, but then I'm like, whatever, it's just a word. It's a word that we have constructed as being bad, and you use it in certain circumstances and you don't use it in other circumstances, and who am I to judge? But it's still like, all these things are still there, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to finish with this is not the finish of my story yet, and
No,
we still have to go through yours. This is going to be like a 30 segment series or
it's all
something.
good.
But I'll finish this week by saying that I completely I guess you could say I took TNT
Hmm.
to my relationship with the church, and I tied together a bunch of things of dynamite and I lit it on fire and completely, blew away my relationships with the church and any possibility of my acceptance there by moving in with the boyfriend
Right.
at 24. And that was what did it. Like, that just did it. That
Right.
said to everybody, Jessica's no longer one of us.
Right. That's right.
And
That's
she has
true.
like gone over the deep end. Like, I
Right.
mean, she has gone over the deep end.
I told what's so weird about that? I remember that big fraughtness during that time,
Oh,
but I'd forgotten that you moved in with your with your boyfriend. Like, I had forgotten about it. You told me now, and I'm like, oh yeah, you did, didn't you? It's one of those things that's like,
oh,
yeah, it
that
just happens, right?
really did it.
Right. Now, I
That did it.
definitely have a different perspective now, because that's definitely something that would not be on my radar.
Oh, no, no, of course not. It's not on
Right.
my radar either. I mean, I'm like,
Whatever.
whatever. But
Right.
um but my decision to do that,
Yeah, that was yeah. That'd be
oh, that was, I can't even describe how hurt people were.
Right. Yeah.
And
We
how
will
that
describe it in
changed
excruciating,
everything.
and we will describe it in more gruesome details next week.
Next week. Woohoo!
Yeah, great. Blowing it up.
I was blowing it up. That's right. All right. So
Well,
until next week.
yep.
Actually, we're going to do this probably on Saturday together in the same room because we're going to be in El Paso, Texas.
Yep.
Next Monday, I'm going to be on my way to Frankfurt Book Fair.
Great.
So we will
Saturday.
do this Saturday.
Yep. And well, we're the sibling duels of Powerssquared. I'm MA.
And I'm JL.
And we'll talk to you. Yep. And we'll talk to you guys later.
All righty.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.